and welcome to Approaches, the Biological Approach. In this session we're going to look at the biological approach, the influence of genes, biological structures and neurochemistry on behaviour. We're going to look at the terms genotype and phenotype, the genetic basis of behaviour and evolution. History and context. Many early psychologists entered the discipline from scientific, i.e. biological areas. Many of them were natural philosophers. So Freud, for example, was a neurologist and Pavlov a biologist. Paul Broca's work in the 19th century investigated brain localization, and that's the idea that different functions for different cognitive abilities are actually located in specific parts of the brain. Charles Darwin made a huge contribution to the field, not only in his theory of evolution by natural selection, but also in that he made many, he documented his own child's development, and in that way was a sort of armchair psychologist. We come across people like Martin Seligman and their biological preparedness, and evolutionary theorists like David Buss. So Darwin's theory of evolution, you probably know the basics. You need to know the basics and then some. Evolution describes how the inheritable characteristics of an organism change over successive generations. All organisms share a common ancestor. So you, I, the frog in your garden, the fish in your tank, we all share a common ancestor that existed at some point in history. All of your ancestors, which is amazing, lived long enough to reproduce. So there is a direct line from our so we can trace our ancestry back to Australopithecus, which is one of the first modern non-hominin ape, and she existed around 3.2 million years ago, I think. So around that time, and we could trace our ancestry back to her. But you know, this always just amazes me. Think back that you're obviously, you know, your parents and your grandparents survived long enough to reproduce, and their grandparents and their grandparents, all the way back to wherever your ancestors originate from. Evolution is undirected. There is no guiding hand, and it's shaped by two mechanisms: survival and sexual selection. So, sexual selection is a form of natural selection, but we often refer to natural selection as being survival of the fittest. So Darwin, for example, proposed that an adaptation that gives an organism a survival advantage, that organism will be more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce, and pass that characteristic or set of characteristics on. So in the case of the giraffe, which is often cited, those giraffes with shorter necks tended to die out. Those with slightly longer necks would survive. They would pass on that long neck gene or series of genes to their ancestors, who would also have, out of all of those, the ones with the slightly longer necks would survive, and the ones with shorter necks wouldn't, and so forth. So over time, the gene for long necks becomes more frequent within the giraffe population. Sexual selection works in a slightly different way. So sexual selection refers to an organism, usually the female, who actively selects for males or members of the opposite sex with certain characteristics. So the peacock is the famous example. Interestingly, Darwin used to say that peacocks used to keep him awake at night because he couldn't explain it from a survival point of view. You've got this massive tail, if you're a peacock, that makes you visible to predators, it slows you down, it costs huge amounts of nutrition to produce. It's a massive disadvantage, so why would we have it? Because actually it helps. Female peahens select males with bigger plumage and more colourful plumage. Therefore, there has been an arms race amongst the peacocks, with those with the bigger plumes being selected for, and those with smaller plumes dying out. Therefore, the big plumes become more common in the population, or the genes coding for them. Evolutionary psychology looks not only at physical traits, but also behavioural traits. Examples of evolutionary psychology then. So David Buss carried out some groundbreaking research. He found in a cross-cultural study that included 10,000 individuals across 37 cultures that there were consistent preferences for members of the opposite sex. So men valued youth, and youth is a proxy for fertility. So every time you see an elderly celebrity trade in their wife for a very, very young woman, the idea being is our evolutionary our desires driven by evolution are to find a mate that is young enough to produce healthy offspring. And because women enter menopause and they have a fertility lifespan that is relatively limited compared to men, that obviously makes sense for men to make those sort of selections. However, for women, they prefer resource gathering ability, so they are more attracted to men with higher status jobs, better incomes, and things like that. Buss proposed that these are basically preferences that have evolved in men and women. Genotype and phenotype then. So you need to know what the difference is. Genotype literally refers to the physical or the genetic characteristics of an organism, so the genes they are carrying. However, phenotype is what you see on the outside. It's the observable expression of those genes. Even identical twins can differ in their environments, and this can produce a different outcome. So if we have a look at the P's here, we've got smooth because capital S codes for smooth. In this case, capital S is dominant, so you get smooth, but then you can get two recessive genes. It's the same gene, the allele's different, but this produces a completely different phenotype. A more interesting example for me is these identical twins, one of which smoked and the other did not. And I wonder if you can tell which one is which. This shows that environmental factors such as nutrition, disease, and habits can change our phenotype despite having, in the case of identical twins, an identical genotype. Influences of genes on behaviour then. Lots of examples, you can look at these in your own time, but it's worth just mentioning that the DRD2 gene comes in two variants, A1 and A2. The A1 variant has been found in high proportions in alcoholics and some drug addicts. Take the endocrine system, produces hormones such as testosterone and estrogen. This can influence a variety of behaviours, from aggression to caring behaviours. Genetics can also affect our neuroanatomy, so structures of the brain can actually grow differently based on our genetic coding. Take Down syndrome, for example. This is a result of a chromosomal abnormality. So the behaviour that is characteristic amongst people with Down syndromes is essentially caused by biology rather than their environment. Neurotransmitters then. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that help messages transmit across the synaptic gap. So remember, an electrical signal is passed along the axon. It needs to jump the gap. It can't do it, so it triggers the release of neurotransmitters that act as little messengers. They bind to the postsynaptic neuron, and if enough of them do, it can have either an excitatory or an inhibitory effect. Changing the concentration of neurotransmitters can change how we behave. Neuroanatomy. Phineas Gage, railroad worker, wound up with a pole through his skull, found afterwards that his behaviour changed in a variety of ways. So if you think about what Broca said about localization of certain brain functions, this was clear evidence that your personality is actually physically located in different parts of the brain. HM suffered from severe epileptic fits. He had parts of his hippocampus removed to try and deal with this. It helped somewhat, but it also destroyed his ability to form new long-term memories, and HM spent the rest of his life living in the present. He would sometimes read the same magazine over and over again. This shows that memory has a physical location, a biological substrate in which it exists, and that damage to that can actually affect your memory system. And Willett and Maguire carried out some interesting research in 2012, where they found that London taxi drivers that have to pass a test referred to as a knowledge, which often takes 2 years to study for and involves memorising every road in London, they had enlarged hippocampi, and there is a association between the hippocampus and route planning and knowledge of different landmarks and things like that. Treatments then. One way we can validate an approach is by saying, what are the potential benefits for treatment? So biological assumptions for things like imbalance in neurotransmitters has led to the development of drugs such as SSRIs. SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they block the reuptake of serotonin. And this means more is left in the gap, in the cleft, for longer, and this increases the chance that they'll bind to the postsynaptic neuron, having an effect. There are many natural ways to elevate our hormone and natural neurotransmitter levels. Exercise, for example, does this well, and that's also effective at treating depression. So we get these sort of treatments from adopting a biological approach, as well as brain surgery like that undertaken by HM, lobotomies, which are not as horrific as they are often portrayed in movies, and all sorts of other surgery. One treatment for the treatment of seizures is severing the corpus callosum, which refers to the neurons that connect both sides of the brain. So they literally just cut through it. This doesn't kill you, it doesn't have any major negative effects, but it can help you deal with severe seizures. Evaluation of the biological approach then. So the biological approach uses scientific methods to investigate behaviour. Experiments often involve sophisticated imaging technology. Development of drugs based on neurochemical imbalances. Give the example of SSRIs, Prozac. It's biologically reductionist. I mean, essentially it says that the cause of your behaviour is things like a neurochemical imbalance. But this ignores environment almost entirely. Think about, for example, if I have elevated hormone levels of testosterone, and testosterone is linked to aggression. But if I'm sitting in an armchair with a glass of scotch or something, I'm unlikely to lash out even with elevated testosterone levels, or if I'm chilling in a jacuzzi. But now I've got elevated testosterone levels, I'm stuck in traffic and people are cutting me up. The chances that I'm going to snap are probably higher. So one of its biggest weaknesses is, yes, it's reductionism and its failure to take into account environmental factors that often are needed to trigger or facilitate certain behaviours. Evolution. Behaviour could be transmitted genetically or environmentally. So a big limitation of the evolutionary approach for behaviour is, even in Buss's research, which, although it was cross-cultural, so that's fairly robust, because if it was learned from the environment or from culture, you would expect that to differ with culture. But the desire for a younger mate might be transmitted culturally rather than genetically. Certainly monogamy seems to be. There are very few cultures that are polygamous. Some Islamic cultures are, but generally in the West, for example, we are monogamous. Some have tried to argue that that's a genetic trait. Some have argued that it's a cultural one. It's difficult to tell. And there are dangers with adopting a biological approach. There are a number. One is potentially designer babies. This is not necessarily a danger in itself, but I always think with designer babies it could spawn an arms race. You know, you up your baby's IQ by 10%, they up their baby's IQ by 15%, and who's going to have access to this technology? The rich, those who are already quite intelligent, and so forth. So design babies, perhaps. Genetic screening for disease is a strength, is a real positive maybe. But also, what about behaviours such as criminality, which seem to have a genetic component, or IQ? Do we start screening people for low IQ and criminality and filtering them in different ways in society? So there are some limitations there. Another limitation of the biological approach is that by focusing on the biology, you're treating the symptoms often. So someone comes in and says that they are depressed and they are low-key and they've got mood issues and they struggle to get out of bed in the morning and things like that. Those are symptoms. But there may be an environmental cause or a relationship cause. Maybe they're depressed because their job sucks or they're being bullied or something like that. And actually, by just treating the symptoms, you're not treating the disease or illness. And a final issue is free will. We've mentioned reductionist determinism tends to go with it, but if behaviour is largely caused by biological phenomena, then no one can be held responsible for their own behaviour because they have very little control over their own biology. If you're born with an aggression gene, let's say, then how can we arrest you when you're caught violently assaulting someone in the street? How can we give you the same sentence as someone who was not born with that gene? It's not fair. You were geared up to fight. You were geared up for aggression. If criminality is genetic, then these people, we don't punish diabetics for being overweight. We say they have a genetic illness, some of them. But that suggests that we can't also punish people with criminal genes. So that's another issue that you could bring up. So all in all there, you've got 7 or 8 different evaluation points. More than enough for a 16 marker. Each would have to be developed into a PEE though. Right, that's enough of that. Let's get on to the activities then. Sam and Dan are identical twins who were separated at birth. When they meet each other at aged 18, they're surprised by their slight differences in looks, but their huge differences in personality. Sam is much more outgoing than Dan, who's always been rather shy. Using your knowledge of genotype and phenotype to explain their personality differences. So in this case, you're going to have to refer to what genotype, what phenotype is, quote parts from the STEM and make sure you tailor your answers there. 2 marks to talk about genotype, 2 marks to talk about phenotype and link to the STEM. Bring your answer with you to class and I'll give you a look at what a really good answer might be for this. Describe how changes occur in populations over time as a result of natural selection. So this is a 6-mark question. This is quite challenging, but I find year on year that students often have, of all the biological elements, the poorest understanding of how evolution works. So if you can write 6 marks on this, you're going to be pretty good. Plan it first before you write it. You shouldn't spend more than about 10 minutes writing this. It's only 6 marks. So write it out. Bring your answer with you next time. Go back to the natural selection slide, evolution slide, and make sure you explain both. And remember, and I'll just point it out and give you the hint, sexual selection is a form of natural selection. So that would probably be included in your answer as well. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in class with some brilliant answers. See you later.